Hello and welcome to Motivation Part 2 notes. Remember that you should have taken your Motivation Part 1 notes in class looking at the theories. But in our next couple notes we're going to be talking about motivation and the areas of which you could be motivated. So to go back a little bit, motivation, the definition of motivation is going to be a need or desire that energizes behavior and directs it towards a goal. So I want you to think of behaviors, observable behaviors, as ending in a goal, something that's being done. And motivation is kind of like the thing that energizes the behavior, that makes it move towards that goal. Right? So you can talk about you have no motivation or you have a lot of motivation. So little energy versus a lot of energy of moving towards a goal. So in class, you should have taken notes over the weekend on the motivational concepts. And the next 3 notes are going to be on hunger, sexual motivation, and then just the need to belong. So our need to belong in a society with other people. Okay, so our first notes are going to be on hunger. This is motivation part 2 notes. Let's start by looking at the end of your last notes, which was Maslow's hierarchy of motives or needs. And I'm not going to go through the whole thing because you should have it in your notes, but I do want you to look at the very first need that needs to be met before you can move on to any other thing is the physiological need. So when we talk about physiological and biological needs in the next couple notes, this is like basic needs. So what he was saying is that if someone is hungry or thirsty or doesn't have their basic needs met, they cannot move up that hierarchy of motivation. They won't feel safe. They won't feel like they belong. They won't have esteem if they're not having their basic needs met. All right, so we're going to talk about those basic needs, hunger, in these notes. So the physiology of hunger. We're going to talk about some studies that were done and then some eating disorders, reasons why people are obese, and kind of the biopsychosocial approaches to it. So physiology of hunger. So in the 1960s, psychologist Washburn wanted to look at why do we feel hunger. So very primitive study, or not primitive, but I want to say there's not a lot of technology. So what he did, if you want to look at this, he actually swallowed a balloon that measured contraction. So he swallowed a balloon that was attached to some type of device that recorded when the stomach was contracting. All right, so there's a balloon, it was inflated, and every time the stomach contracted, it recorded it on this device here, the stomach device. I don't know what that was. And then he also pressed a key every time he felt every time he felt hungry. All right, and what he noticed after they took all these readings is that every time your stomach contracts, you get something called a hunger pain and you feel hungry. So this would actually be the biology behind hunger, right? So there's something physically happening in your stomach, it's contracting, and that sends a message to your brain that says, there's nothing in here, we need food, all right? So there's a correlation between every time your stomach contracts and feeling hunger, okay? Now, there's some more biology reasons beyond why you feel hungry. So I'm going to list them here and then talk about them. But the first one is going to be, we've talked about glucose before. And glucose in the form of, probably in biology, we looked at it as the sugar that's released. But glucose, as far as you're talking about hunger, is the sugar that circulates in your blood. And your levels of glucose in your blood are indicators of how hungry, whether or not you need more food or you have too much food. All right, so insulin is the thing that regulates the glucose. We have already talked about insulin when we talked about your endocrine system. So these things right here, these are all going to be our endocrine system, right? Because the hormones are being released. Endo, gluco, all right, insulin. So my pancreas is in charge of making insulin. Remember, insulin is the thing that goes out and removes glucose from the bloodstream, or if there's not enough glucose, it allows it to be released. All right, so it's anyone who is diabetic doesn't have regulates their glucose or insulin levels, so they have to take shots. Okay, another biological, so the hypothalamus, this is in my central nervous system. We've already talked about these 2 parts of the hypothalamus, so it's just review. But my hypothalamus, remember my 4 F's, one of them's feeding, fighting, fleeing. So feeding, your hypothalamus is in charge of eating, right, whether you're hungry or not. And there's 2 parts, the lateral and the ventral medial. We've already talked about these. The lateral, let's eat. It releases a hormone called orexin. I think that's how you pronounce it, orexin, and that's the one that says you need to eat, we're hungry. And then the ventral medial hypothalamus, that's the vomit. That is, we're done eating, right? So lateral says let's eat, ventral medial says we're done, okay, vomit. Remember the hypothalamus is right below the thalamus, and then the pituitary gland is in the middle. And the pituitary gland is that gateway in between the endocrine and the central nervous system. A little bit of review there. So more biology, sorry, I heard someone behind me. More biology there for the hunger. Okay, so these are the biological reasons why we feel hunger or whether we feel full. Now there's some more that you're going to need to know, and I'm going to stop right here on this. So this chart here are more hormones that are associated with appetite. Just copy it down right now. I'm going to actually have you guys look these up in your book in class. So copy that chart down in your notes, and then in class during tutorial you're going to fill this in. So there's more hormones that are associated with eating than just insulin and the orexin, and they're right here in this diagram, but I'm going to have you look at them in class where they're released and what they do. Okay, but you need to know, so take a minute to copy down that chart, pause, copy, and then unpause. Is all those hormones are trying to get your body to something called the set point. And the set point I want you to think about is like your body's like natural weight. It's set weight. It's where it says this is where we should be, and if we drop below my set point, then your body is activated to start eating. If you are above your set point, then you actually go into eating less, right? So it's kind of like your normal maintained weight. Some obviously people's set points are different, right? So my average, or the weight that my body's feels comfortable at, my set point might be different from someone else who might even be my same age and same height. All right, so there's fluctuation of set points there's individualistic differences. And then your basal metabolistic rate, or a metabolic rate, this is your resting metabolism. So if you're not moving, if you're not doing anything, this is like the amount of energy your body just needs to get throughout the day. So if you're laying on a couch doing nothing but like flipping the remote, right? So your body still needs calories just to pump blood, right? For your heart, for breathing, for basic metabolic activities like breathing and your blood pumping. So that's your metabolic rate. It's how much you burn without doing anything. You've probably heard that word metabolism before, but teenagers tend to have a higher metabolism. And as you get older, your basal metabolic rate tends to decrease, which means you don't need as much to eat to maintain your activities throughout the day. All right, so let's talk about more biology with taste preferences. So taste preferences, what people have found tend to be, so the things that taste good or bad to people, tend to be genetic and universal, meaning that throughout the world, people tend to like and dislike the same taste. And you can think about taste on your tongue as those chemical receptors, so the chemical things that are in foods that make you either like it or taste good, sweet, salty, or bitter. All right, so those are those chemical reactions happening in your mouth that send the signals to your through your thalamus. So genetically and universally speaking, people tend to like sweet and salty. All right, this is what's been shown is that carbs, so things that are really like sugars, and then salty things like breads or pretzels have a lot of salt on them, of carbs, they actually boost serotonin, which if you remember what serotonin, that's my feel-good neurotransmitter. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter that makes me feel good, okay? So it might be good, genetically speaking, to eat things or be prone to like things that are going to make you feel good. These might be considered like your comfort foods, right? So things that are sweet and salty, Oreos, right? Pretzels, popcorn, right? Things that might be junk food tend to be like our comfort foods that make us feel good. Now, universally, there's also something called neophobia. Neo meaning new, phobia having a fear, and this is a preference to not eat things that are unfamiliar to you. You look at something, it might look odd. That is called, like, you might not want to just try it. Some people are more open to trying new things, but neophobia is a taste preference that actually makes us avoid things that are unfamiliar to us. Again, this might be a biology predisposition to get rid of or to avoid foods that are bad. And then adaptive taste preferences, two things we're going to talk about. In places of warm climate, the spices that they use tend to ward off bacteria growth. Okay, so people that live in hot climates tend to like spicier food and are not as, what do I want to say, reactive to spicy food because they're used to it, and they're used to using spices because spices get rid of bacteria, right? So the bacteria can't grow when it's warm outside. And there's also taste preferences during pregnancy, especially around the 10th week when the fetus is at its most vulnerable stage. And around 10 weeks, they start avoiding food. You get that nauseous feeling because you don't want to put anything in your body that might be bad for the fetus or the unborn child. So people that get morning sickness tend to start having morning sickness around 8 to 10 weeks when the fetus is most susceptible to being hurt by things that you eat. Okay, now let's talk about some eating disorders. So this is all biology, and this is really where the psychology comes in and starts to trump the biology. So the thoughts of eating are overriding your biology, your basic set point, your metabolic rate. We'll talk more about all three of these things in class, and I put a long description here because I think it's really interesting and very relevant to your lives, especially women who are 75% more likely to have an eating disorder than men, and the majority of them start during adolescence. So the three things you see here, so anorexia, bulimia, and then binge eating, you need to know the general description of them. And then in class we'll talk about why you think or why we think they're more prevalent these days than they used to be. It's nothing new. So anorexia, which is a fear of gaining weight, is classically just that very thin, frail right here and then modern day here. Half of the people who are anorexic binge and purge, meaning that they lose control sometimes and eat too much, and then they purge by either vomiting or laxative or excessive exercise. But anorexia is postered or looked at as 15% weight and drop in weight and still having a fear of gaining weight. Right? So they're nervous that everything they eat is going to make them gain weight. So anorexia nervosa. And then bulimia nervosa is a fear of gaining weight. They're both usually starts as diet, but when the diet is broken by a forbidden food, whether it be fats or carbs or sugars, that overeating, so the binging of eating a lot, is followed by purging, which is vomiting or laxative, by fasting. So if they ate a lot one day, they won't eat anything the next day or for a week, or excessive exercise. This tends to, that cycle of overeating and then binging and purging tends to lead to more states of depression, weight fluctuations, and it's easier to hide because it's tending not to have that dramatic weight going down like the 15% frail looking. So bulimia is more prevalent, it's easier to hide, and it is marked by things of like excessive eating and then purging. And then there's also something called the binge eating disorder, which is that binge eating, excessively eating, but there's no purging afterwards. The binge eating is similar somewhat to like binge drinking. We're just drinking a lot of in a short amount of time. You might be influenced by peers to eat a lot or to drink a lot, but there's no purging afterwards. All right, so let's look at the levels of analysis or hunger motivation. You know what, actually, we're going to do this in class. I'm going to skip through this, so don't write down the biopsychosocial for class. Let's end by talking about obesity, so the opposite of an eating disorder. So obesity and weight control. Obesity is being over a percentage for your height over weight. So overweight is going to be like over the set point with it for your height, and then obesity is more than 30% over your weight. Okay, so there's historical explanations for obesity. Why would your body want to hold on to food? Is because in the past, food tended not to be as prevalent as it is today. So there wasn't food everywhere. There wasn't McDonald's. So we had the tendency to eat when we could, and then our body would store that fat because there'd be times when we couldn't eat. It's not the same today that we have this overabundance of food, right? You can eat whenever and whatever, and it tends not to be very good foods. So historically speaking, it's going to be where our body wants to keep on to food because we need it for energy. Now, the statistics we'll talk about a little bit in a second, but I'm going to show you a graph of obesity and life expectancy, what that's going to look like. A little bit in the statistics, though. Over 66% of Americans are said to be overweight. So this is not obese, but 66 are said to be overweight. And then the definition is going to be not overweight, but over 30% above your body weight, okay? So here's the what the percentages would look like. So this is different. This is a super complicated graph, right? So on the bottom here, you're looking at your height in meters or your height in feet. So find your height right here. So if I'm 5'4", and then it's looking at what you weigh, right? Or 5'5", and then looking at what you weigh in pounds. This is kilograms. Don't look over here. This is going to be you guys. So if you're here, then you're in a healthy range, right? If you're over this amount, which is 150, it's considered overweight. If I'm 5'4" and I weigh over 175, it's considered obese, and over 250 is called morbidly obese. All right, so this is an interesting chart. You can find your height and look at your band. And here's my life expectancy looking at body mass. So the more massive in body, the higher the weight, your risk of death just skyrockets, especially in men. All right, so over your body mass index of 40, your relative risk of death is 2.6 more than the population. Okay? Now, or the social effects of obesity? So if someone is obese, it is definitely looked down upon in our society, right? They have something called weight discrimination. They're looked at not having be able to control what they eat or not having control over their lives. And because of that, it has profound psychological effects, meaning that they're often depressed, and their mechanism for dealing with depression is to eat more. So you can see how it could be a cycle. And because they eat more, they feel depressed because they couldn't control themselves. So we'll end with these statistics on weight discrimination. So here is a study that was done on the willingness to hire. So one that would definitely not hire a 7, they definitely would. In normal, the average was about 5.5 for women. This is interesting, versus men. And then look at the overweight. So women less likely to be hired if they are overweight than men that were less likely to be hired. Women in general are less likely to be hired, and we can talk about that later. But men in general that were overweight were not as discriminated against as much as women were. Okay? So what we can look at, I'm going to skip through that. But so our obesity and our weight control, the physiology, there's definitely a genetic factor. So people who are obese tend to have parents and grandparents that were obese. But there's also other things that lead to obesity. The activity factor. So how much sleep someone gets, how much social influence there is, how acceptable it is in your family among your peers to be overweight, or how unacceptable it is. And then also the food consumption at activity level. So if you're a really active person, you can eat more food. If you're not an active person, if there's a lot of video games or sitting at home watching TV and you keep up the same food consumption, you're more likely to gain weight. Okay, so the physiology of obesity, there's all those factors, the biopsychosocial, that we'll look at in class that affects obesity as well. For people who are obese, looking to gain or lose weight, the most successful persons, the success stories, have realistic and moderate goals. So they're not looking to lose 100 pounds in 100 days, but lose 5 pounds in each week or something like that. And they also have huge attitude changes, meaning that they have a different attitude about themselves, an attitude about how healthy they should be. Okay? In our next notes, we're going to talk about sexual motivation. So again, the biopsychosocial aspects of why people are sexually driven. And in the notes after that, we'll talk about our work ethics. Okay? Have a good day.